अगर कोई क्राइम करता है, सोच समझ के क्राइम होता है, क्या ये लोग सोचते हैं?
I never assume just on the basis of the allegation. Good person, bad person. When anyone walks into my office, as should be the case with any lawyer, it's a clean slate.
So what are the most common criminal charges in Canada?
Common, I would say, assaults and offenses involving violence are probably the most common. And I only
domestic violence?
I've seen both sides of it. I've seen cases where it is genuinely domestic violence. It's true, both male and female. So I'm not, it's both sides.
हम कनाडा में हैं, अगर XYZ पर्सन अगर क्राइम करता है, बाय मिस्टेक हो जाता है या कुछ भी, या प्री प्लान्ड क्राइम करता है, what will be the procedure whole?
So it's important you speak to a lawyer, and the lawyer will give you advice. You operate on that advice. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more a bit later, but just in terms of after that process, the police then will determine, are we going to give this person release or not?
So, Jessie, कौन से केसेस के लिए आपने काम किया है अभी तक?
Cases involving assaults, both between strangers, domestic context, friends, stabbings, shootings, drug trafficking I have involvement in, murder cases.
So, कभी आपको डर नहीं लगा?
Honestly, no. No.
We all know कि कनाडा में कैनाबिस लीगलाइजेशन के बाद लीगल हो गया इसका, कोई कैनेडियन लॉ में इसके चेंजेस आए हैं? अगर जस्टिस के बारे में बात करें, यहाँ की जो जस्टिस सिस्टम है, एक वर्ड में,
we are a democratic country. We have a justice system that is based on fairness. Overall, we have a very good system.
We are proudly Canadian. हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम बैक अगेन। सो आज का पॉडकास्ट का जो टॉपिक है ना, बहुत इंटेंस टॉपिक है। आज हम बात करेंगे कैनेडियन लॉ के बारे में, मतलब कानून के बारे में, क्राइम के बारे में, जस्टिस के बारे में। आप बिल्कुल ठीक समझे हो। इस पॉडकास्ट की जो थीम है ना, वो है इनसाइड द कोर्टरूम, द रोल ऑफ क्रिमिनल डिफेंस लॉयर। और हमारे जो आज के गेस्ट है वो है मिस्टर जेसी ब्रार। जेसी ब्रार इज अ हाईली एक्सपीरियंस क्रिमिनल डिफेंस लॉयर इन कनाडा। सो एंजॉय दिस एपिसोड, और मैं चाहती हूँ कि आप एपिसोड आज पूरा देखिए और कैनेडियन लॉ के बारे में बहुत सारी बातें जानिए। सो एंजॉय दिस एपिसोड एंड प्लीज वेलकम द जेसी ब्रार, criminal defense lawyer in Canada, on and with Priyanka. Hello, JC.
Hi, Priyanka. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Very good. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me. I would say hello, Sat Sri Akal, namaste to everyone, and I appreciate being here.
Yes, thank you so much, JC, and it's an honor to have you here.
Appreciate
Welcome
that.
to the On Air with Priyanka show.
Of course. Thank you.
So, you know what? भगवान की दया से मैं कभी क्रिमिनल लॉयर के सामने ऐसे बैठी नहीं हूँ। और आज अगर बैठी हूँ तो सीधे इस पॉडकास्ट के लिए थोड़ी नर्वस हूँ। काफी सारी क्राइम के बारे में बातें जो करनी है हमें।
For sure, yeah.
Yes. So, first of all, JC, as a criminal defense lawyer, तो हम बात करेंगे all that crime, ठीक है, जो अभी हो रहा है एक्चुअली। तो आप बहुत सारे क्रिमिनल के साथ बात किए होंगे, उनके साथ काम भी किया होगा। क्या माइंडसेट होता है अगर कोई क्राइम करता है क्रिमिनल्स का, कि मतलब सोच समझ के क्राइम होता है, क्या ये लोग सोचते हैं?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's a great question. So it is, I would simply say this. There is a perception when it comes to criminal justice and people that commit crimes. And I think it's important for the general public to remember that a lot of people that find themselves in the office of a lawyer like myself or other colleagues of mine are people like us, everyday people, professionals, family, kids, and it is the worst day of their life. And a lot of times when people think of criminals, right, the term criminals, they think of gang members, drug dealers, these kind of things. But a lot of people that come through my office, again, are people that just find themselves in a situation. Maybe it's a domestic situation with a partner that has spiraled out of control. Maybe it is a situation with their children. Maybe it is a business dispute that has turned aggressive and then violence enters the equation. Maybe someone's drinking during these types of things. So I would say, when your question is, what goes through the mind of people, I would say it's a very raw and human thing. And I never judge. And I think that is a hallmark that every defense lawyer ought to have and should have, because again, we have this perception of people come in charged because they've done something super egregious and criminal. But it's often not like that. And a lot of people, when I share these stories, and I know we're doing so today on the podcast, but when I have these discussions with friends and family, and obviously without mentioning names of clients or anything like that. Well, it's I would say it's not even as simple as the regret. It's sometimes there's so much gray in the law. In the sense that what one person's perception of something is may not align with the other person's perception. So you may have someone who is charged with something, and the public may say this person's charged, they're a criminal, which I wholly reject, because you're just accused of something. You're not a criminal or someone convicted of a crime until that process has happened. But ultimately, like in terms of the thought process, I would say is this: there are some clients, for them, it is the kind of situation where they are in and out of the involvement. That is sort of the trade for them. There are those clients. Just, that's the reality. But there are a lot of people who are not regularly involved. There are a lot of people who come to me who are students, professionals, homeowners, kids, families. They are reputable members of the community who find themselves in a situation that they never ever imagined they would find themselves in. It could be a misunderstanding that has spiraled out of control, or it could have been a situation where one set of circumstances caused them to act out in a way that was completely out of character for them. So it's hard to diagnose or pinpoint what goes through the mind of somebody, but I would say that it is a very real, raw, and human thing that people deal with. And for me, especially as a criminal practitioner, I think it's important that I never judge anybody. I never assume anything, right? I've had clients charged with sexual assaults, murder, gun weapons offenses, serious assaults. I never assume just on the basis of the allegation, good person, bad person. When anyone walks into my office, as should be the case with any lawyer, it's a clean slate. Right?
Exactly.
I'm here to protect you and defend you, and that is the role of criminal defense lawyers generally. But ultimately, it's a situation where again, any one of us, any of the neighbors could be people that have found themselves in a situation. We just never know that because our dealings with them otherwise are so positive, right? But again, it's the kind of thing that, especially nowadays with the advent of social media, everything's being recorded. You have an argument with someone at a stoplight and the phone is pulled out. Anyone can be
People
in a
just
situation
started recording.
at any time. So it's important to be very careful these days.
Oh my God. So what are the most common criminal charges in Canada?
Common, I would say, assaults and offenses involving violence are probably the most common. And
domestic violence?
There's a lot of domestic violence allegations. And again, I've seen both sides of it. I've seen cases where it is genuinely domestic violence. It's true. There are other times where I've seen the partner, both male and female. So I'm not, it's both sides. Suggesting that there is a complaint made for the purpose of some kind of leverage, right? There's a divorce, there's custody, there's a complaint that comes in as a result of the custody issue. Now that factors into the custody, or there's a division of assets. So there are other things that come into play. And again, not every case is as malicious as that example, but those are the kind of things that, more often than not, find themselves coming up in some way, because in every situation, there are two sides of the coin. Right? And ultimately, violent offenses, is what I was going to say, are pretty broad in that domestic assaults, as you said, Priyanka, assaults of any kind, assaults with weapons, a more serious assault being a homicide or a murder, right? That falls into an assault as well, because it's a violent offense. So it's a very broad category, and that sort of captures everything. Aside from offenses involving violence, property crimes are pretty big, especially nowadays. We are seeing break and enter, thefts, people, committing robberies, things like that. And we are also seeing, not as much in the criminal context, but there are a lot of drive impaired or drunk driving charges too. Right? Or like cell phone tickets, things like that. I would say those are the most common, but nonetheless, there is these are broad categories,
Yes,
right? That seem
exactly.
to encompass a lot of different.
So जैसे अगर क्राइम के बारे में अगर बात करें, हम कनाडा में हैं, अगर XYZ पर्सन अगर क्राइम करता है, बाय मिस्टेक हो जाता है या कुछ भी, या प्री प्लान्ड क्राइम करता है, व्हाट विल बी द प्रोसीजर होल? ऑफ कोर्स पुलिस आएगी, आपको अरेस्ट करेगी, फिर उसके बाद बेल, अपॉइंट अ लॉयर, ये क्या होता है पूरा प्रोसीजर?
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to, at the outset, make sure that I'm clear with the viewers. Anytime someone is charged, it is by law.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure that this is understood by everyone. It's an allegation. So when when we say it's committed a crime, we have to be clear in that it's has alleged to have committed a crime, right? Because it's not proven, right?
Yep.
And obviously we don't want anyone being stigmatized with you've committed a crime, and if they say, well, I haven't committed anything, and there's a trial maybe 2 years later, and you're carrying this cloud of people thinking you've done something for 2 years, right? So when you're alleged to have committed any crime, because it's an allegation, right? It's a complaint. What happens is this: typically the police will arrest you.
Okay.
They will lay a charge, and when the charge is laid by the police, at that point, the next question is, and I'll back up actually. Charge is laid, and ultimately they have to connect you to a lawyer. They have to provide you your rights upon arrest. They give you an opportunity to speak to a lawyer. That is something I recommend everyone do in every scenario, whether you think it is not a serious case or not. Always ask to speak to a lawyer.
Okay.
Always. I can't stress that enough. Everything is noted. Video recorded sometimes. There's audio, because that can become evidence in your case later.
Exactly.
Right? So it's important you speak to a lawyer, and the lawyer will give you advice, and you operate on that advice. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more a bit later. But just in terms of after that process, the police then will determine, are we going to give this person release or not? The things that are considered in that process is, your record and your history. If you're given release, you're typically given, at least here in Manitoba, you're given paperwork. Here's your court date. You have to come by that date. You have to have either a lawyer in place by that date, or you have to personally attend by that date. And that period in between, typically that date between arrest and first court date is a couple months usually away. The reason for that is because the police take some time to prepare the file, and then they pass the file along to the Crown Attorney's office, the prosecutor, public prosecutor, right? And once that first court date begins, then the case officially starts. Now, you had asked about appointment of lawyer.
Yes, exactly.
Now, on that point, there are two ways. You can go to legal aid, for example, if you meet certain financial requirements, and they will just appoint someone to you. Or alternatively, if you have a lawyer who is willing to do your case on legal aid rates, then that lawyer can be requested through legal aid, saying, I want legal aid to cover it, but this person has agreed to accept legal aid's rates. Or you can go to someone in a private capacity and just hire them and contract out, the service as you would in any other area.
So if you are going to appoint a private lawyer, so of course you have to pay a little bit more extra.
Correct.
Or
Typically. Everyone has different rates, but love legal aid. Legal aid is great, but legal aid is not paying always what things are worth, right?
Exactly.
So, sometimes lawyers are hesitant to take certain cases on legal aid because the work that goes into particular cases is substantial. And sometimes on legal aid it may not be worth it, not from the perspective of making a ton of money, but there's costs and overhead and things that have to be considered as well, right? So there's those options, and that'll be between the lawyer and the client to figure out the arrangement between the two of them.
Exactly. So very well explained, Jessie.
Thank you.
Whole procedure. So actually, अगर किसी का criminal background नहीं है, अगर first time किसी से crime हो जाता है, which was not even planned, like कभी-कभी self defense में crime हो जाता है, कितनी सारी assault की cases आती है, right? तो ऐसे first crime के लिए, especially in Canada, कोई ऐसे first time sentence program है?
So just so I understand your question correctly, are you talking about restorative type of things outside of court, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, there are, and it's a wonderful thing. Basically, there are different procedures and options available by way of restorative processes, counseling outside of court, anger management, and it will depend on the nature of the case, right?
Yes, exactly.
If you're accused of, stealing from a bank, let's say, as an example, anger management is not really connected to that, right?
Exactly.
So
it is a pre-plan.
if I say to the Crown Attorney, my client will take anger management, and will you accept that as an out-of-court settlement? He or she will probably say, well, what does that have to do with the charge, right? Versus if my client is alleged to have committed an assault, right, involving a domestic partner, then the Crown may say your client has no prior record. And those would be discussions that I would have with the Crown, where I would present those points, and I would say, my client has no prior record. This is a domestic situation. He or she could really do well with some counseling, maybe some classes pertaining to relationships, healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, the Crown Attorney's role is to be an advocate and counsel for the public, right? The Crown Attorney is not acting solely on behalf of the complainant in the case. They are the government or the public lawyer. It's interesting, actually, when you look at any case on the style of cause, like when you look at any document, it will say His Majesty the King versus the person, meaning the Crown's office represents the king, and I know in Canada we still pay respect to the monarch and stuff, but really the point is it's a representative of society. The Crown Attorney is representing society, right? So they will look at what the complainant has alleged, but they'll also look at the big picture too, and there will be times where we can arrange out-of-court settlements because they will say, and I often have this because of my representation that deals a lot with the Indo-Canadian community, where I will say, look, my client is charged with this offense. He is a permanent resident, or he is here on a temporary status. And if he is convicted or found guilty, this will impact his immigration. In those circumstances, the Crown would say, in the big picture, is it worth deporting this person over this? We can be satisfied that if they take this class, if they do these other things outside of court, then that is enough for us, right? So those options are available, but they become less available the more serious something is, right? If you're accused of a serious violent offense, then the ability to dispose of the charge by way of a restorative approach, it decreases, right? Those approaches are typically reserved for first-time offenders with lesser to semi-moderate serious offenses. But as you go up, like for example, on a murder charge, you would never get restorative options on that. It's just, it's just too serious of a charge, and the public would be outraged, and understandably so.
I can say, right? बहुत ही straightforward है कि अगर आपका क्रिमिनल बैकग्राउंड नहीं है, अगर आप फर्स्ट टाइम क्राइम कर रहे हो, तो ये सारी चीजें उस पे नोट की जाती है जब आपकी फाइल कोर्ट में पहुंचती है तब.
Of course, exactly. That's exactly right.
So, Jessie, कौन से केसेस के लिए आपने काम किया है अभी तक?
So I have experience as a criminal lawyer. We are in court a lot, and that's the thing I love about the job. The human aspect, being someone's defender and shield, that is a significant draw of the job. But on top of that, I think we're in court more than any other area of law. Right, criminal lawyers are probably the lawyers that are in court the most. And in terms of cases, had cases all the way from simple assault up to first degree murder and everything in between. So cases involving assaults, both between strangers, domestic context, friends, stabbings, shootings, drug trafficking I have involvement in, wiretap investigations, like complex investigations involving those types of things, murder cases, and
web series में नाम सुने हैं मैंने ये सारे.
I've been very fortunate that I've been around some very good people in my career, and from an early stage I was involved in some pretty fun cases and quite interesting complex cases that have really helped me develop my abilities. So I'd say anything from assault up to murder, I've pretty much had the ability to deal with everything so far, and I've also been fortunate in gaining significant experience in appeal work. So when people are found guilty, and if they want to appeal after and say, we think that the judge got it wrong, and they want to appeal it. I've been in the appeal court a number of times as well, and have experience with that as well, which, again, I credit the people I work with for teaching me those things early, and that set me up for being able now, down the road years later, to do those cases on my own. And I have experience in that area as well.
So इतने सारे आपने केसेस हैंडल किए, सुन के भी ऐसे होता है ना कि ओ माय गॉड, मर्डर के चार्जेस, फिर ड्रग ऑफेंस के चार्जेस, so कभी आपको डर नहीं लगा?
Honestly, no. No. I think you can't have a weak stomach in my line of work, because you see some not so pleasant things, right? We have to review evidence. There are pictures I've seen that I would never want to show anybody. People that have been, victims of homicides, the remains, like autopsy pictures, like those are things that we have to see to prepare for cases. And it's not fun to look at those things, but it's a necessary part of the job. So, I think if you are scared and that kind of thing, it may not be the right area, right? So for me, I just, I was able to separate pretty quick in terms of, I can't be scared and I can't let this sort of rattle me, because there is a job to do. There's a client to protect and fight for, and I have to put whatever I have aside and focus on the job at hand.
Absolutely. अगर ड्रग ऑफेंस की बात करें जेसी, so we all know कि कनाडा में कैनबिस लीगलाइजेशन के बाद लीगलाइजेशन हो गया इसका, कोई कैनेडियन लॉ में इसके चेंजेस आए हैं?
There have. So cannabis particularly is not as big of a concern in courts anymore, because cannabis used to be listed as a scheduled substance, meaning under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which is the criminal law that deals with drugs, it was listed as a scheduled drug, meaning if you had possession of this drug, then you would be possibly found guilty or accused of trafficking a scheduled substance, right? After the legalization of cannabis in around 2015, I believe it was 2016, I believe that was one of the first things that Prime Minister Trudeau actually enacted. They reclassified that, and it's no longer classified in the schedule as it was before. Now, cannabis offenses are subject to the Cannabis Act as opposed to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So we see dispensaries all around the city, all around the country, thousands upon thousands. You can go buy it legally at your own leisure. Taxes are paid on it, just like alcohol. And there are laws in place in terms of if you are to grow it at home and have your own plants at home, there are limits on how you can have that type of thing. So the cannabis charges that I've seen, and they don't come up that often, but will be, you are allowed to grow X number of plants. You had more than the limit. So it's more regulatory in nature, where it's like a ticket. It's not treated in the same criminal context as it was before legalization. For example, prior to legalization, it was in the same category of scheduled substance, the same way cocaine, methamphetamine, and those serious drugs are. There's been a shift in the perception of cannabis, such that it's not looked at in that same manner anymore, and it's now subject to a different legislation, and it's not treated the same way.
तो इतने सारे केसेस हैंडल किए हैं आपने, ड्रग ऑफेंस के बारे में भी बातें की है, ऑफ कोर्स आपने बहुत सारे केसेस हैंडल किए होंगे इसके बारे में या किसी और क्राइम के बारे में. सो डू यू वांट टू शेयर एनी योर स्पेशल केस और एनी थोड़ा सा बोलते ना कि टेढ़ा केस you want to share with us?
Sure, of course. There's a case that comes to mind, and I know when we were talking about criminal justice a bit earlier, you had talked about self-defense and some of those things. And this is a case, the one that I'm about to talk about, was very interesting. And I hope you find it interesting as well. But I thought it was very interesting because it dealt with sort of, if you're giving an introductory class to high school students about criminal law and the human element of criminal law, the raw emotion that can be involved in criminal law, the legal stuff, the procedural issues. It kind of had everything. So the story is this. My client at the time went to a corner store to, get something. And ultimately, to spare some of the longer details, what happened was while he was there, there was an interaction he had with someone who he had never met before that date.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Just a stranger.
Yeah.
That interaction started verbal. There was some talking, swearing. There was some cursing, and it kind of elevated a little bit.
Okay.
And it ultimately resulted in the other person pulling out a knife on my client.
Ooh.
And again, to spare you some of the little back and forth details, ultimately there is an interaction between them outside of the store where my client is stabbed a number of times.
A number of times.
Yeah, he is stabbed he has a ruptured spleen, I believe. He had a punctured lung. His artery was cut and he was bleeding out quite profusely.
My God.
This is from someone he had never met. And it was just they were in line and started kind of having this dispute type of thing. Something totally avoidable, but he was attacked first. And during the course of that attack, he took the knife away and defended himself and inflicted stab wounds on the other person. Unfortunately, the other person that attacked him first died as a result.
Shoot.
My client was not the kind of gentleman that had infinite financial resources. He was a more vulnerable member of society. And as a result, they immediately take him from the scene to the emergency room, and they do surgery on him because he is severely injured, of course. And as soon as he is done with surgery, the police attend, they charge him with murder, and they take him to custody. Now, this is again a gentleman that can't get bail, and the charge of murder is the most serious charge in the criminal code, right? That is the most serious charge because it carries a life sentence.
Exactly,
right?
life and death, yeah.
So what happens is he is charged, he is in custody, and of course he is very stressed out. He's worried because he understands that if I'm convicted of this offense, I am looking at a life sentence in custody. And what was interesting about that case was when we talk about, and I know this isn't part of one of the issues we've talked about, but there have been studies about prisons, right? And the effect of prisons and how helpful they really are in rehabilitating people, right? There are some studies that say, it's meant to be punitive and all the rest. But there's a lot of studies that talk about how prisons are not really as helpful as is being perceived, and they are compromising inmates' mental health because they're not treated really well in there, right? So my client, over the course of the years that he was in custody, and he was in custody for, I want to say 3 years, awaiting trial.
Awaiting trial?
Because it takes a long time to get to court. And, he was not treated particularly well by the institution. And, he was at times put by himself in segregation, things like that. And over years and years and years, in terms of the effect that had on him, not being able to see people on a daily basis when they would put him in segregation, right? And look, prison's
what was his mistake, right?
Prison's not meant to be easy, right? And no one's saying that it should be a hotel, right? But at the same time, 3 years of segregation to non-segregation, being moved from here to here to here, and the prison that he was at, wasn't in Winnipeg, so it was outside of the city. I couldn't go visit him on a daily basis. It just wasn't practical. We spoke on the phone multiple times a week for years, right? So we spoke probably 2-3 times a week for over the course of 2 to 3 years, I would say. And the effect that process, just being in custody, awaiting trial for years, what that had on, from what I can just sense in his personality, was alarming and staggering, right? It really drove the point home for me. Like, you read these reports about how prison changes people. I got to see it every day with this person where his personality was one way and then he became withdrawn and his personality changed because you're sitting in a cell all day, 24 hours a day. You get a little break every day for years. And those are years of your life that you never get back, right? So ultimately the case goes to trial. And we ran a self-defense argument, of course, given the scenario. And he was found not guilty. He was found not guilty and he was acquitted of murder, which is the right decision, right? He took steps to protect his life. And I think as human beings, just, forget me as a lawyer or you in your professional capacity during this interview. As human beings generally, that is something I think we can all get behind, because as humans, we are survivalists.
Yes.
All right. We will take whatever steps we need to protect ourselves, our loved ones, right?
Of course.
So when we talk about memorable stories, that was a case where I thought, when you read about it in the news and you look at it on its face, you just see man charged with murder and you think, oh my God, right?
Exactly.
And then you get to know what happened and you think to yourself, I would do the same thing.
Yes.
If that was my life on the line. And it's horrible and unfortunate that someone lost their life. The loss of life cannot be downplayed, and it's just horrible what happened, right?
Exactly.
For all sides.
Yep.
But you think back to that client and you think, man, if I were in that position, I would do the same thing, because I'm not going to let someone take my life.
Exactly.
And not that he at that point was thinking, I'm going to take his life. He took steps just to preserve his own. And the consequence of that was, unfortunately, the other gentleman lost his life, right? But that was a really memorable case for me, because it was a journey, right? Where started here. We talked all the time while he was in custody, because he didn't have many supports in the community, right?
Absolutely.
So I became almost like a sounding board for him. We would talk.
लोग पहले ही दूर भाग जाते हैं. अगर कुछ ऐसा केस दिखते तो पहले ही.
Of course, that happens a lot. And then when he was found not guilty, he was released after years. Now imagine trying to rebuild and reintegrate after years, right?
Exactly.
You kind of lose perspective on how things are.
Everything. मुझे लगता है जैसे कि एक mental trauma भी होता है.
100%.
Right?
100%.
3 years ये केस अगर चला है.
You don't get that time back.
Exactly.
Right? You can make money in life, you can lose money, make money, you can't get your time back. Life is, you get what you get in terms of your time on earth, and you don't get it back, right? So you lose those years, and it's devastating, right, for him.
Absolutely.
But what was interesting about this whole thing is when he's released, he then comes to the office to see me in person.
Oh.
His personality, totally different.
Really?
Upbeat, positive, thrilled with life. And some of the impatient features that he had while he was in custody are all of a sudden gone. And then I think, well, yeah, of course,
because
right?
Of the
you get your freedom back.
Exactly.
Completely changes a person, right? You go from being in a cell all day to being paranoid, upset, on edge, to now you are outside. And you're breathing real air. And it was a fascinating case, and one that will probably stick with me forever. Because when I talked about the high school class example, this is a case that had raw emotion. Because I think when we strip away the legality in the process, if we just say to anyone who is, old enough to kind of understand, hey, would you protect yourself if you had to? Everyone would say, well, of course we would, right?
Exactly.
So it had that. It had, a murder case going to trial. Like that is a high stakes type of case, life sentence, right? Like,
exactly.
So it was a very high stakes case. And again, just the way it all played out and seeing the change in him over the course of that time was just, it really drove the point home about the prison system is not, I understand, like there's not a right solution. What is the system to do? It was hard for them to justify releasing him because he had nowhere to really go. And so I understand that part of it.
Yes, exactly.
At the same time, the other flip side of that is he doesn't get the years back. You'll never get that back.
Exactly.
Right? And if we feel like 3 years is a long time in the community, I can only imagine, and I've never been in jail, right? But I can only imagine 3 years in a cell, that would be devastating, right? So that case really sticks out to me because of just, it had a bit of everything. Right? And yeah, I mean, it just really drove the point home why I think criminal defense is so important, because things seem one way. The media will often report short of a snapshot, here's what it is, but then when you really get to unpack it, the picture is very different.
Exactly. I actually agree with you, Jessie. और अगर इसकी अब हम बात करें, जैसे थोड़ा सा रिसर्च तो मैं भी आपके बारे में करके आई हूँ इस पॉडकास्ट के लिए. आपने इतनी सारी केसेस हैंडल की है, हर केसेस एक नया आपको एक्सपीरियंस देती है, राइट? और हमको सुनने में आया है कि आप अपना नया फर्म भी स्टार्ट करने वाले हो.
Correct.
तो इस पॉडकास्ट से बेहतर और क्या होगा?
Of course.
So do you want to share something about that?
Sure, of course. So I'm happy to announce, and I appreciate you raising it. So as of May 1st, 2025, a few colleagues of mine at the current firm that I'm at, we are branching out and we are launching our own law firm.
Wow.
So the law firm's name is, and it's just the names of all the partners. It's Staggerwald, Hodge, Pinks, and Brar, LLP. We are committed to continuing to practice criminal defense in a cutting-edge way. We practice with zeal, fervor, and enthusiasm, and we are all very passionate about what we do. And it was just, for us, a really good opportunity to work together. We are all in and around the same age, and in similar positions in life. So we thought, what are we looking to do over the next 20, 30 years?
Exactly.
Who are the kind of people we want to be around?
Yes,
and we are all confident in each other, right? We all trust each other. We work really well together. And ultimately, I think we are all a reflection of the people that we surround ourselves with.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So for me personally, and I think as a collective, I can speak for everybody, it made sense. It was the right time. And yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into these kind of things.
Of course.
Launching a firm, but we're thrilled and we're excited. And we look forward to providing the same dedicated, cutting-edge legal services that we have throughout the years. That is not going to change, just because we are now at a different spot. And so very excited. And I appreciate you asking about it. And, and yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Yes, definitely. So, ये हो गई हमारी सारी आज की बातें. Like before anything crime happen, अगर कुछ हो जाता है, पुलिस आपको आएगी, अरेस्ट करेगी. सबसे पहली चीज आपको क्या करनी है अरेस्ट होने के बाद?
Ask to speak to a lawyer. Immediately, full stop. That is where, and I can't stress this enough, the amount of clients I have seen find themselves in so much more trouble than they would have been otherwise because of the fact that they didn't exercise their right to speak to a lawyer, and also not saying anything to the police, and those sort of go hand in hand. So,
because everything will be recorded.
It's not just that. So the police have an obligation that as soon as you are arrested or detained, your right to counsel under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is engaged. So the police have the obligation to say, you're being detained or arrested, you have a right to contact a lawyer. Do you have a lawyer in mind? We can connect you, or one will be appointed for you through legal aid. Right? Sometimes clients say, yeah, no, it's fine. I can talk to a lawyer later. Wrong. Always ask to speak to a lawyer. Always. Right? Because a lawyer
Before
will
giving you any justification, I want to talk with my lawyer.
Absolutely. Because what the lawyer will do, whether it's legal aid or your own lawyer, they will talk to the police, get a briefing of what has happened, and then they will be able to advise you on what, if anything, you should be saying to the police.
Yes.
That takes me to my next point. I would say in 95% of scenarios, we are telling our client, you can't say a word. The reason for that is because everything is being recorded, and the police make very clear anything you say can be used against you, right?
Yes.
So, and I'll give you an example. I've seen cases where, in murder cases even, the police are kind of unsure about things. They don't really have the strongest evidence. And then through questioning, the person will say, well, I was there when it happened, but I didn't do it. And they think they're giving a right answer. But you've already confirmed that you were there. So you've given half of the puzzle away, as an example.
Exactly.
Right? And so, but they think sometimes, because they're not aware of their ability to just stay quiet, they think that they're doing a good thing, that we're giving them something to, look, as humans, we're all agree, we want to please, right?
Yes.
With police, there's a power imbalance. So sometimes we just want to say, look, I'll be agreeable, I'll help them. They'll just let me go. If I say nothing, they'll get mad at me. We have that thought sometimes, right? But it is so vitally important that you cannot say anything unless your lawyer gives you advice. There are situations where sometimes I talk to a client, I understand the situation, I say, in this situation here, there's value in saying something, but we have to limit sort of how and what we say, right?
Exactly.
Because that is going to form the evidence in the case as well. And I've had cases where clients did not even realize they have become the worst evidence against themselves because they've talked too much. And they don't realize that. And that's why speaking to a lawyer is so important immediately. And then after that, dependent on the advice, which will typically be, you can't say anything, that'll really guide someone going forward. The other thing to note is, It's a bit of an awkward thing for most people because the concern is if I stay quiet, does it look bad? Does it look like I'm hiding something? Right?
No, it's
and sometimes
not
people
hiding
are,
something.
but a lot of people
Yeah.
are worried about that. They think,
Yeah.
you know, if I haven't done anything wrong, why can't I just say I've done nothing wrong? Because otherwise it looks like, well, what do you have to hide? Right?
Exactly.
The concern is this though, right? First and foremost, a lot of people don't know, and it's important to know that there is a constitutionally guaranteed right to silence in law.
Yep.
Your right to silence cannot be used against you to infer guilt. So there cannot be a finding later, or it can't even be argued. It's not allowed. That the Crown can say, Priyanka had the chance to say she didn't do it. She didn't. Clearly she's hiding something. That means she must be guilty. Can't do that, right? So that should take away people's fears about, well, I should say something, otherwise I'm going to look bad. The other thing too is, if you say one little thing and you're sitting in a room, and I can tell you, those rooms, there's a chair bolted to the ground. It is not a very inviting, like your set is very inviting and warm. That's the complete opposite of what that scenario is like.
Oh my God.
And it's cold and dark and intimidating. And if you give one thing in terms of an answer, it never ends there. There's more questions, there's more questions, there's more questions. You usually will have two officers on one side and they're grilling you. And then you fall apart. Which is why if you just stay silent and say nothing, that is your biggest
And they
protector.
cannot force you.
Never.
Yep.
You can. I've had some clients, and I thought it was funny actually. I had a youth client years ago who I said, "You can't say anything. You can't say anything. You can't say anything." And I was concerned because she was underage. She said, "I'm just going to go to sleep." She said, "Can they do anything about it?" I said, "No." I thought it was genius.
Yeah.
So what she did is after we spoke, because they can't interview you until after you've spoken to a lawyer, right? Because otherwise, how are you supposed to know what you can and can't say, right? So they came in after I was done talking to her. She asked for a blanket. They gave her a blanket. She went on the floor, put the blanket over her head, and went to sleep. And
oh my God.
in the video, they are talking to her, saying, "Listen," and they're posing questions to her. She's just not answering, and she's just blanket over her head.
A clever mind.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah.
They were getting frustrated with her. They were getting annoyed with her, saying, "You know, you're not taking this seriously. You're showing disrespect."
Exactly.
She was sleeping. Lovely.
Oh my God.
Well, however you have to get there, get there.
To shut your mouth and...
You got it, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that immediately ask to speak to a lawyer, and if the police delay connecting you to a lawyer, because sometimes they'll say, "We'll call your lawyer in like 15 minutes. We're going to deal with you first." Sometimes they'll do that and they shouldn't be doing that. But if there's a delay in getting to a lawyer, in the meantime, don't try to justify. Don't try to say, "Well, I was only here and I only saw this and I only helped do this," and just say nothing.
Yes, exactly.
It's hard. It's nerve-wracking, but just say nothing.
That's really
It'll pay dividends down the road.
Yeah. So ये हो गई सारी हमारी क्राइम की बातें. अगर जस्टिस के बारे में बात करें एक वर्ड में, यहाँ की जो जस्टिस सिस्टम है, it is like fairly.
So I would say, I'm not going to single out any other countries, right?
Oh yes.
By name, but we have a very good justice system here.
Great.
We are a democratic country. We have a justice system that is based on fairness.
Yes.
And it is based on the concept of justice and doing right by people, right?
Yes. So people can trust you.
Of course, it's not perfect. And what I mean by that is there are times when we've seen throughout the history, and Manitoba particularly has been a little bad for this, but there are wrongful convictions that happen.
Yeah.
If you Google wrongful convictions Manitoba, over the last 50 years, there have been a number of people who have been convicted for murders that they never committed. And they spent 12, 15 years in jail before they are freed. And again, we talked about never getting your time back.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Those things happen. And it's horrible, and it's just the worst thing that can happen. That being said, though, we have process here, due process. We have fairness. We have trials. Trials here are not just show trials. They are trials in which judges will very carefully listen to the evidence.
Yes.
Juries that we have here, if there's a jury trial.
Yep.
I think people here that sit on juries, and all of us as Canadians, we take our civic responsibility very seriously.
Yes.
And I think if people are selected to be a juror,
Yeah.
they take that very seriously. It's not the kind of thing that they're just trying to get out of, right? So our justice system is, while not perfect, in the grand scheme of things, I think it is a very good system. Again, there's always room for improvement in any aspect
Absolutely.
of life, right?
Yeah.
But all things considered, when you look around the landscape and some of the things you read in the news about how things are done in other places,
Yes.
I think we as Canadians should be fortunate that we are in the country, that the system, is designed to be fair, while not always.
Yep.
But that is the intent. Judges work hard, crown attorneys work hard,
Yep.
defense lawyers work hard. Everyone's trying to do right and trying to do the right thing. And there are times when, again, it goes the other way, but overall, we have a very good system. And I think we all should be counting our lucky stars that we are in a place where
We are
democracy
proud.
is,
Yes.
is at the forefront.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really great, Jessie. We are proudly Canadian.
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So
we're lucky to
Yeah.
be in Canada, and Canada is a great place, and we take it for granted. The same way
Yep.
when I spoke about my client who was in custody for years, we take freedom for granted in Canada, right? Because
Yeah.
we can move around and do
Yep.
things so easily.
Yes, exactly.
And in other places, you can't have that same
No,
level of
no.
freedom and
हर
mobility.
कंट्री का एक अलग अपना लॉ का रूल होता है
Yeah.
एंड वी आर रियली फॉर्चुनेट कि कनाडा थोड़ा सा इसमें अलग है.
Of course, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely, 100%.
वैसे ना जैसे ये टॉपिक जैसे मैंने स्टार्ट में बिगिनिंग में बोला था, इतना इंटेंस टॉपिक है ना, क्राइम, जस्टिस, एवरीथिंग,
Sure.
कि इसकी बातें जितनी करो उतनी कम है, मतलब
Right.
डीप जाते जाओ.
Right.
बट वी हैव अ रिस्ट्रिक्टेड पॉडकास्ट टाइम.
Of course, 100%.
So before we wrap this podcast,
Sure.
so इस podcast का आखिरी सवाल आपसे.
Okay.
So any advice you want to give us the Canadian people,
Okay.
podcast viewer, कि अगर by mistake अगर कोई crime हो जाता है,
Sure.
ठीक है, सो उनको सबसे पहले क्या करना चाहिए और क्या क्वालिटीज उनको लॉयर में देखनी चाहिए,
Okay.
सो दैट मतलब वो अपनी जो आगे की फ्यूचर की जिंदगी है वो प्रॉपरली अच्छे से जी सके.
Yeah, very good question. So, two-part question.
Oh,
The
yeah.
first part about it was, what should they do first? And as I answered before, call a lawyer. And because we've already discussed that in detail,
Yes.
I won't go through the reasons as to why.
Yes.
Because I think, I'll simply say this. I always tell clients, because I'll have clients that call me sometimes, or prospective clients who will
Yes.
say, do I really need a lawyer? And I say, would you do surgery on yourself? And they say, no, I wouldn't. I said, it's the same thing,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
You shouldn't take a chance because, look, like as lawyers, there's typically 7 to 8 years of post-secondary school after high school. And that's just to be able to get a basic understanding. And then if you're specializing in criminal law, then there's other things. So, it's taken me and people in my profession a very long time, years and years of study to be able to navigate the process.
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't recommend anyone who is a non-lawyer to just say, I'm going to do it myself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
It's just not wise. And I don't say that as a general proposition for lawyers to be hired. But again, I always give that example to clients, and clients
Yes.
laugh and they say, oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you wouldn't operate on yourself.
Exactly.
You shouldn't. And I know sometimes we all go on Google and say,
No.
I have an injury. What does this mean? And Google's going to give you crazy answers.
Exactly.
You should go to a doctor who will tell you the
Yes.
real answer.
Yeah.
Same thing. You should go to a lawyer. But in terms of the qualities that one should look for, this is a very important relationship between a client and a lawyer, right?
Yep.
It's guided by trust and solicitor-client privilege and other factors to consider. Personally, I think every client needs to be comfortable and trusting of the lawyer that they are dealing
Exactly.
with. If you have doubt,
Exactly.
you don't trust that person, it's not going to work.
Yep.
Right? Because your life is on the line in different capacities, right? There are times when, like the client I discussed, he was looking at a life sentence. So his life was literally on the line.
Yes,
But there are
yeah.
times when people are charged with lesser serious offenses, maybe no jail time,
Yep.
but the criminal conviction could still limit their ability to go to the States.
Yep.
And they may say, well, that's huge because me and my family, we go to the States 3 times a year for trips. I
Yep.
can't have that happen, right? So every criminal case, whether it's a more, whether it's a lesser serious charge, whether it's murder, it is for that client, it is the most important thing in their life.
Absolutely.
And every case should be treated as such. So you want a lawyer that does not say, well, your case is just not that serious. You want a lawyer that treats your case with the seriousness that it deserves. You want a lawyer that you can trust. Your lawyer is your shield, really. Right? If the criminal justice system is the state, your lawyer has to be your wall and your protector against the state. Right? So you need someone you can trust and you feel comfortable going to war for you in sort of that way. The other thing too is I say this to every client, and I think it's something that every client should be mindful of is, if there is ever a lawyer who is promising you or guaranteeing you an outcome, run as fast as you can the other way. The Law Society prevents us from making guarantees. One, it's unethical, but also how can we project what happens in the future?
And you can change the lawyer as well if if you want.
Of course, you can always change your lawyer, but I would say when you're first sitting with someone and you're deciding who should I hire, if someone says, hire me and I promise I will beat your case, I would suggest you run the other way. What lawyers can promise is, I promise I will fight for you. I promise I will do everything in my power. I will do everything in my control.
That is more realistic answer.
Of course. But if someone says, and I've heard it, right? Where pay me this will happen. Right? That is the kind of thing that not only should we not be doing according to the rules, but it's just the kind of thing that realistically we can't forecast. The same way in which it's a beautiful day outside. I think tomorrow is going to be nice. And if I say to you, Priyanka, I promise tomorrow is going to be sunny. And then tomorrow, if it rains, you're going to say, well, you promised me this. Right? It's better to make guarantees all you want about your effort. Totally fine. But I would say you want to look for someone who is not giving you false assurances of any kind, is realistic, is upfront, is honest, is trustworthy, is someone that you are confident in, because this is someone that is going to have to go in front of a judge or a jury for you and make your best case. And you want someone who is going to present it with the same vigor and zeal that you would for yourself, right? You need someone that is going to be a fighter for you. And I think those are the qualities that any client should look for in a lawyer.
Wow, that's great, Jessie.
Thank you.
मैं अपने सारे व्यूअर्स को बोलना चाहती हूँ कि ग्रेट पॉडकास्ट है। कैनेडियन जस्टिस लॉ के बारे में अगर आपको जानना है, कैनेडियन सिटीजन होना, तो दिस इज द पॉडकास्ट फॉर यू गाइज। डोंट मिस इट। क्राइम ऐसी चीज है ना, कोई प्री प्लान नहीं होती है, राइट? एनीबडी कैन फेस एनी टाइम, राइट? एग्जैक्टली। बट जेसी, ऑनेस्टली थैंक यू सो मच कि आप मेरे पॉडकास्ट पे आए, एंड इट वाज अ वेरी ग्रेट पॉडकास्ट। आई कैन सेंस इट, क्योंकि बहुत सारी इंफॉर्मेशन मुझे भी नहीं पता थी। मैं, जैसे मैंने बिगिनिंग में ही बोला था, आई वॉज क्वाइट नर्वस, क्योंकि कभी ऐसे बात नहीं किया लॉयर के साथ। तो
I hope I didn't scare you too much.
Oh no, not at all. It's a learning session for me. मैं हर पॉडकास्ट में कुछ ना कुछ सीखती हूँ, और बहुत अच्छी है, मुझे एक फेज मिली है इस पॉडकास्ट में। बट थैंक यू सो मच अगेन। यस, एंड आपके फ्यूचर लॉ फर्म के लिए आपको बहुत सारी बेस्ट विशेष।
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I appreciate that. I also want to say thank you to you for having me on. Thank you to your viewers for the time. And again, for what it's worth, I just want to say I think you're running a great channel, very informative. I think information is key, and especially for the Indo-Canadian community, the system back in India is different. Not just in law, but I've seen some of your other videos about other areas. There are differences, and I think the more information we can provide, it's better for everyone, and your channel is doing a great job with that. So I also thank you for
you so
the
much,
opportunity, and
Jessie,
keep doing what you're doing. Of course.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.